Welcome to Tales from the Fandom, a podcast that brings a special guest out of the multiverse and straight to you. And now your host, David Ginsburg.
Hey everybody, I wanted to let you know about a campaign I'm taking part in called 2 Pods a Day. It aims to introduce podcast listeners to 2 independent podcasts every day for the month of August. We hope to give visibility to some of the great indie podcasts that you probably haven't heard of. 2 Pods a Day encourages you to listen more and listen indie. You can find more shows like mine by following hashtag 2PodsAday on Twitter or by searching for 2 Pods a Day on Facebook. Or you can go to www.2podsaday.wordpress.com to see all the episodes and podcasts that are going to be promoted in August. I'm not sure if that's up yet, but it will be once August rolls around. And I am very happy to be a part of it this month, or next month in August. But I hope you enjoy the episode that's coming up, and thank you for listening. And welcome to Tales from the Fandom. We've got a special guest on the show today. His name is Kristian Serrano, and he is one of the hosts of a new podcast that's up and running called Manifest Zone. And that is a podcast that talks specifically about the Eberron game setting for Dungeons & Dragons. Welcome to the podcast, Kristian.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited to have you too. For those who don't know you, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so outside of the gaming sphere, I'm a web developer at a university for a library, actually. Web designer, I should say. Do a lot of work with usability, user experience, web design, development, etc. But of course, that's not what we're here to talk about. I am a huge gaming nerd. I will say that I really didn't get into RPGs until around 2003, when 3rd edition, not 2003, 2000 or 2001, whenever it was, 3rd edition came out. And it's so long ago. And I was really into video games at the time. I was playing Baldur's Gate. I was obsessed with Baldur's Gate. And my friend, a good friend of mine, was like, hey, 3rd edition just came out. A friend from work is going to start a campaign. Are you interested? And I was like, I don't know. Okay, yeah, I'll try it out. And I was just hooked. It was just like crack. I loved the open-endedness of our tabletop RPGs. It was just the collaboration, just hanging out with friends too. It was just fantastic. My first major campaign was Return of the Temple of Elemental Evil. Actually, I'm sorry. We started with Sunless Citadel in 3rd edition, and then we went to Return of the Temple of Elemental Evil. And I played a rogue thief acrobat fighter who I still love that guy. And it was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, campaign ended after a while with a TPK. And the GM was just like, yeah, no, you're all dead. Sorry, not continuing. So that was really heartbreaking. I still hold on to that. I have all my original character sheets from that character as well. And I started trying my hand at GMing probably around just before just after 3.5 came out. I was still running 3.0. Then I switched to 3.5. About a year later, when I was running, I was running Greyhawk. I turned into a big Greyhawk nerd. I was eating up anything and everything I could research and find. And then Eberron came out, and I was like, oh, that looks interesting. That'd be kind of cool to get into a setting that was A, designed for this current version, this edition of the system, and B, is just now launching. And there were a couple key factors about Eberron that I really liked. One was that they had pretty much dictated that they're never going to advance the timeline. And that was a problem I had with a lot of like Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms, where they had a meta plot that they advanced over time. I felt it was really hard to keep up. I'm a slow reader, so keeping up with novels was like, that's just a non-starter for me. And that was the other thing, that the novels that they came out with were non-canon. It's just sort of a version of a story that you can either be inspired by or you can incorporate, but it doesn't dictate any of the events in the setting itself, which I thought was great. So being in from the ground up and being able to buy things, as they rolled out was really appealing. And I just got hooked on it. I love pulp. I love, I shouldn't say pulp. I love two-fisted, action, right? I love a noir intrigue. And those were things I was actually trying to do in Greyhawk before I even read about Eberron. So just that alone was appealing, but then really seeing the unique take on a fantasy setting and the idea of magic being used instead of, electronic technology was really appealing. Instead of gunpowder powder even. Also that it was relatable because you can look at things in that setting and sort of translate it to something that you're familiar with. Like an elevator is a lift in Sharn. Sky coach, that's a taxi cab, right? So all those, things that you see in movies and stuff, you can kind of place them and use them in their conveniences that change the way we play a fantasy setting. So that's really where it was at for me. And yeah. So yeah, and then eventually I actually had to stop playing for a little while because I had my first child was born. And so that was, kind of like, okay, we're done for now. During that time, actually I switched to playing Savage Worlds because I had heard it was, real simple, really easy for people who have busy lives and really fast to play. And I got the test drive rules and I read through it and I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what I've always wanted to do with Eberron or with, just fantasy RPGs in general. But D&D didn't quite let it happen in some ways. And the first time I played Savage Worlds was also the night that my wife went into labor. So I think there's a connection there. But yeah, after a while, then I just really got into Savage Worlds. And I've been obsessed with it since. I even had a podcast, Savage Bloggers Network podcast, where we covered sort of weekly news, things that were going on in Savage Worlds in the community. And that was with Ron Blessing, who was also big in the Savage Worlds community. He and I became good friends. I used to listen to a lot of his stuff back when he did the Game's the Thing podcast. If you don't know the Game's the Thing, you should go back and listen to it. They are all still available, and they were great. He and his wife, Veronica, did a great job on that podcast. And so Ron and I...
Listen.
Yeah, you should definitely check it out. And... So Ron and I became friends because, I would just start talking to them online and we became really good friends. We still are good friends. We talk, just online all the time. And, we even kind of joke about trying to do another podcast at some point, but, we're both busy with other things. So, but he's the one who actually encouraged me to get into podcasting, which was really cool. So I have to thank Ron for that. So Ron Blessing, if you're listening, thank you, buddy.
Going back a little bit, because you and I apparently started right around the same time for role-playing, because in college is when I initially joined the group that was playing 2nd edition, and then 3rd edition came out, and so we had to transfer all of our characters, or basically just make new characters, because they didn't really transfer that well.
Right.
But played that, always homebrew, always stuff going on, always like real wacky shenanigans, and of course, during the college years, it was sometimes there would be issues between players and the DM and slamming of the door and quitting. And the dungeon master would be like, I don't like what you guys are doing. You're breaking my story. Oh. Get out. Those type of things. But then we also played, we had like every like Friday would be Dungeons and Dragons, but then Saturday would be like Vampire the Masquerade,
right?
Or Star Wars. Like it was all like we all had these different games going on, and it's just so much fun. Just an incredible time for gaming in general in those early like late 90s, early 2000s period. It seemed like role playing was really just, at least in my group, hitting like all cylinders, all sorts of games going on. Everyone was into it.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was definitely a bit of a surge there because it wasn't even on my radar really until then. I think a friend of mine tried to get me into it, into D&D actually. I still have the book way back when I was in middle school, but it just didn't really take off. But something happened right around that period, late 90s, early 2000s, that it seemed to take off really.
For you, do you have, specifically for like Dungeons and Dragons, do you have like a certain race or class that you tend to gravitate towards more so than others?
I love rogues. I absolutely love rogues. I don't know what it is. It's not even the whole thieving thing per se. It's just the versatility, I guess, that comes with them. I like multi-classing rogues as well. That's why, like the Thief Acrobat Prestige class was a big favorite of mine. And it's just a fighter thief combo or anything even similar to that. Like I remember I was kind of intrigued by the Swashbuckler class when they came out with that, things like that. And I think maybe it's because of that swashbuckling kind of feel, that acrobatic, nimble, agile type of character. And as far as race, It's weird. They're not like a crazy powerful race or anything to that effect, but half elves always appeal to me. Half elves or half orcs, but I was always interested in half orcs. I never got to play one, but half elves I've played, and that's kind of a weird personal thing, which I'm happy to go into. It's so I'm Puerto Rican and Cuban, but I was raised very American.
Okay.
And so I was never really like Latin enough, to be, like I don't speak Spanish fluently. I didn't really listen to. I appreciate like salsa and stuff, or even like I love Latin jazz. That's one of my favorite things. But I just never really. I guess I just felt like I never really fit there, But I also wasn't, being Puerto Rican and Cuban, I wasn't necessarily American, I was born in the U.S., but I just didn't quite relate, I guess, to fully to American culture in a lot of ways, because I still had my foot in the door, or not my foot in the door, but my straddled both sides, I guess. So half elves just kind of always appealed to me because they're sort of like they're connected to both worlds.
Right.
But they're not quite, maybe they're like their own thing. And in fact, Eberron, that's one of the things I really liked about the half elves in Eberron, is that they're really their own thing. They're not trying to be one thing or the other. They just went ahead and forged their own culture. They're like a true race that's been breeding for, however long. Just that always appealed to me, I guess, in that regard.
I always gravitate for when I make characters, it's almost always halfling first.
Oh.
And it's not because like Lord of the Rings or anything like that. I just love playing characters that maybe you're just not expecting them to be one of those great characters. Like you don't think of a halfling fighter that often. You don't think of a halfling doing much besides being like the rogue or a cleric or something like that nature. And when I played 3.5, I had experimented with like a halfling like ranger, I think is like a ranger cleric at one point. But then when Eberron came out, and one of the pictures is halflings riding on dinosaurs.
Yes,
it's almost like that's right up my alley. That's like classic 80s cartoon dino riders type stuff. And so I got to play is a crazy multi-class because is all backstory type stuff, and I had to like flesh him out correctly. It was like a barbarian ranger.
Yes.
And he was crazy ridiculous. Like there were other martial type characters in the game, but his character, or my character, was the one that really was out in the front lines dishing out the damage. And just I mean, you read about what the Talenta halflings are supposed to be, and I hope like when I was playing him that he matched up with that, just because of how brutal his character was.
Oh yeah, and that war mask. Oh man, like I just love that artwork. Like that, I think the art direction of Eberron is one of my favorite things, quite honestly.
Oh, in that first book, I mean, that's one of those things, especially you have the Warforged on the front, I believe it is.
Yeah.
But then you go into that book and it is that artwork that they went with, and the direction and everything is just picture perfect.
Yeah. I actually just recently dug up the original article. I think it was Gearing Up for Eberron or something like that, where they did an interview with the art director for that. And I was just like, yeah, that's right. I forgot about this. And it was, that's a fun read, by the way, if you haven't checked that out. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I've been diving back into some of there's a Facebook page, I think, that's called Eberron. I don't know who runs it, but they do a lot of the reposting of a lot of Keith Baker's old posts, and
nice. Yeah.
a lot of like they share stuff from like Pinterest boards of people's artwork and Maze Arcana stuff. And so it's constantly like every day there's a new post about something, and it's stuff from years ago, maybe stuff that's more recent, and it's just really fun to be able to read that and just dive back into the Eberron world, because right now it's not really like something that's on Wizards' radar, with the exception I think that they released an Artificer class, but it's not like an Eberron Artificer so much.
Very generic, yeah.
But,
yeah, they have the gunsmith specialty, I think, in there as well, which a lot of people were like, what? Cool for a generic setting, but not Eberron. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Good stuff.
So with Eberron, you got into it. Like, is that? I mean, you had Greyhawk, but then you just fell down the Eberron rabbit hole. What was it like? I know we talked about it a little bit before. Like the setting is out there for almost any kind of story, like a noir story. You got the dungeon, aka Seer or Siri, that's set in the middle of the main map, Corvair.
Right.
You have like the island of Zendrick you can go adventure in and do those kind of adventures. Like when you got into Eberron, was it just a combination of everything, or was there a specific thing that drew you in?
I think it was it had to be the combination, because I was reading about it. Yeah, I think through Dragon Magazine they were doing like a year kind of ramp up kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course that, I was reading about it a year after that, just as they were releasing articles online, and they had the Dragon Shards articles and stuff like that. So I think it was just the idea of there was one article, Dragon Shard article, where they talk about swashbuckling, right? Or Adventuring 101. Right. I think was the title. And I was just like, oh my gosh, that's what I want. That's what I've been wanting out of Greyhawk, or just D&D in general. I told you I played a thief, acrobat, rogue, fighter, right? That was my thing. And then I liked noir movies, especially some of the newer noir stuff, like the film Payback, for example. I really love. It's one of my favorites, and that's sort of an homage to noir. So I think it's just the combination of all those things. And then of course the artwork was evocative. It was imaginative. I love Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's one of my favorite movies. You have this sort of anti-hero character exploring exotic locations and so on. Yeah, I think it's just all of it. Like it all hooked me. I mean, there were some things that were kind of like, at first I was like, I don't know if I care about that thing. Like, I don't know that I really cared about the Dragon Mark houses per se when I first got into it. But as I dove into it, I learned to really love it. Like I got what was going on there. In fact, our next episode of Manifest Zone, we'll be talking about Dragon Marks and Dragon Mark houses, which I'm excited to get into, because there's so much rich stuff going on there. Yeah. I think that's really it. It was just kind of everything over time. I just, it just hooked me, man. And it just kept reeling me in,
Do you have a favorite nation of like a playable nation that you tend to gravitate towards, or that you just enjoy either throwing characters at or into, or having characters represented from that specific nation? And it can be beyond like the 5 nations. Like you can Droam or Talenta Plains, anything like Moorholds.
I really like. So as far as running or playing, of course we always default to Sharn in many ways. I did do a campaign based in Stormreach once, which was fantastic. That was really fun. But as far as just general interest, there's a few, quite honestly. The Shadow Marches, I like the idea of that. Just because of the gatekeeper druids, the orcs, the half orcs, the communities of orcs and humans living together peacefully. The Manifest Zone to Zoriat and everything that's going on, that's included with that. Aberrations, things, all those kinds of things. It just seems very versatile in that regard. Droam recently became more interesting to me after Keith did that one article for Dragon Magazine during 4th edition, which I think was on backdrop for Greywall, I think was what it was. And what else? As far as honestly though, I think I'm more keenly interested in regions or other continents. Zendrick, for very obvious reasons. There's so much going on there, and you can really do whatever you want. I have a strong interest in Sarlona. I haven't had a chance to do a lot with it, but I love what's going on there. It's a completely separate setting almost. Like you could really you could pick up Secrets of Sarlona and it's almost its own campaign setting.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's very separate from the Dragon Mark houses and from the lightning rails and airships and all those kinds of things. It's just its own thing. So I find that appealing as well. Yeah, I think those are my top picks as far as areas to explore. Yeah.
I know that when we were playing actively and the product was coming out, one of the things that we kept hoping for and wishing for was, because they had the Five Nations book and then the Zendrick book and the Sarlona book, and it would have been nice if there had been a book that focused on like the other the other areas, such as like Talenta Plains or Droam, Kabara, like just those places, just to get a more like a better feel or a richness to that area beyond what was just initially written about.
The Moorholds, the Zalargo and the Talenta Plains and Valinor, all those places, right? Yeah, that would have been that's on everybody's wish list, I think. That and Plains of Eberron, because I think the plains really open up a whole nother space to explore as well. Yeah.
I was listening to Manifest Zone, and you guys had someone had mentioned that the start of their initial campaign was the airship going into a Manifest Zone onto another plane.
Oh, yes.
And I had never even bothered like with the planes, even as a GM or playing in someone else's campaign. They never bothered with the planes at all. But it's such a rich thing in Eberron to tie into, but it just seemed like there's a lack of information at times to really get something going as far as setting wise with like the planes and what's going on in the planes. And
yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think, and they're very different from the traditional, Great Wheel cosmology. It's nothing like that cosmology at all. It's very, very different. I love the fact that the planes are about aspects that sort of shape Eberron. You know what I mean? Like they're literally like elements of Eberron. They influence the world. They shape the world. They affect the world directly in many ways as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that, and I know the other, the Great Wheel works to that in that regard as well. But it just seems more direct in with Eberron's cosmology.
Do you have a favorite of the nations? Like if you were running like a long ranging campaign, would you ever have the nations come together again to make like a post Galifar, or would you just have it separate? Would it be a continuous like kind of Cold War intrigue, like these nations are going at each other, or there's small alliances, or more like political intrigue?
I think I see the Five Nations sort of how I see our real world, and not just the Five Nations, but even the other nations now that they're mixed into it. Keith talked about this when we did the Lost War episode, where it was never just 100 years of constant fighting. Mm-hmm. There were, stops and starts along the way. I could see it transitioning not just to one single war, but just like variation, like just different wars that occur over time, where you have different alliances and you have different enemies, and somebody decides to vie for power in this region, or they decide to take over this or that for whatever weird reasons, whether it's they're being influenced by the Dreaming Dark or by the Lords of Dust, or they're just being plain greedy and they want to maybe conquer the Moorholds. Maybe Karnath wants to conquer the Moorholds again, right? Or something like that. And I could see stories like that going forward, but but also the last war didn't end peacefully, right? It just ended because everybody was too afraid of what happened to Seer happening to them. It's this unknown. So there's still tension. There's still a lot of resentment. There's still a lot of anger and loss and pain and suffering. People are not necessarily okay. So I think it could go either way in that regard. But I don't know that they would ever really come together again. I don't know that there's a reason for them to, unless it's some greater threat. But even that would be temporary.
Now, with you had mentioned that you got into a new game system, and it's been out for a while now.
Yeah.
And one of my friends in North Carolina loves the system, and he's used it with Deadlands before and a few other different games, and that's the Savage World system.
Yes.
And you said you got into it when we were talking earlier in the episode. You had mentioned that it was something that's supposed to be like a quicker play or quicker game type setting, or not setting, but like a system.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. So Savage Worlds doesn't use classes, for example. They don't have a massive tome of spells. What they do for powers, for example, is they have a smaller set, and you use trappings to vary them, and the trappings can actually affect them mechanically as well. So, for example, if you have like a bolt power, it could be electricity, it could be fire, it could be ice, it could be shadowy energy, it could be a swarm of bees, whatever you want it to be, really. And so there's a lot of opportunity for uniquely customizing, and even how you cast it can be customized, and that's by design. They really strip down the skill set, for example. So instead of having listen, spot, search, I forgot, is that it? Anyway, they just have a single notice roll, notice skill. When you want to do an attack, it's either shooting or fighting or throwing. One of those skills. If you have shooting, it's anything, and crossbow, bow and arrow, whatever. They don't get nitpicky about it, which is nice. And then really, instead of, like I said, there's no classes, but what they have are edges, which are sort of like a combination of what class abilities and feats are in D&D. And you can just customize your character however you want. The big draw for me really was things like bennies, where with bennies you can, if you don't like your roll, you can just re-roll it all together if you want to. And you have like so many bennies that you start with at each session even. Unlike action points, which were like per level, this was per session. So it's very empowering in that regard. Character creation is really fast. You could probably do it in about 15 minutes. Really fast and easy. Prepping for a game or for a session is really easy. For stats at that time, this was before 4th edition, mind you, you just give the creatures whatever you think they needed. Whereas compared to 3rd edition, where it was like you have to build them out as if they were characters, which was, really time consuming.
Right.
Yeah, it was things like that. And then, of course, 4th edition started showing some hints of similar concepts. 5th edition even more so, where you have advantage and disadvantage, where you can roll 2d20, take the higher of the two results. That's very similar to the wild die in Savage Worlds. Anytime you roll a trait roll, which is either a skill or an attribute, you get to roll a d6 with that, and you get to take the higher of the two values. And those values those dice can explode as well, by the way. So you could have a d4 in a skill, but you might get to you get to roll that d6 with it, and that d6 is gonna it could just as easily explode as the d4. So.
And exploding is where when you roll like the highest number, you get to roll it again, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. And then you just keep adding until you don't explode anymore. And so that was really cool. It felt empowering as a player to me. I felt like my characters were more capable in that regard. The same thing with bennies. Bennies were very empowering. And at that time too, 3rd edition, if you remember, you couldn't move, attack, and move. You had to get spring attack.
Well, you had to get a feat, and that feat took forever to get unless you were a fighter.
You had to get 3 feats because it was dodge, mobility, spring attack, right?
Yep.
And that was just how it was in Savage Worlds. And I'm like, why can't we just say that that's how every character acts? Like that was another empowering moment. I was like, yeah, these actions are occurring concurrently. You're moving and you're attacking. Why not just let you? Like, why was that so forbidden in D&D that you needed 3 feats to do that, So that was just another example of where I was like, the more I read Savage Worlds, the more I was like, this is how Eberron should be played. Like, I felt like D&D 3.5 or 3rd edition in general was very busy telling me what I can't do as a character. And Savage Worlds was telling me what I can do as a character. So I think that was the sort of realization for me as to and why I switched to it.
And you created, now was it you alone or did you have help? But you created a Eberron Savage Worlds like manual.
Yeah, that's it's still ongoing. I don't think that'll ever end. I did start pulling originally pieces from content that people had published before me. Only because I had I was trying to study how other people did it. I didn't know Savage Worlds well enough. And I made a lot of mistakes early on where I was trying to do literal mechanical translations, which is like in Savage Worlds, it's like, no, you don't do that. Like you instead look at the idea and then you reinterpret and you adapt it to Savage Worlds, right? You don't try to do direct mechanical translations at all. Because that way will lead to madness and over complexity. And it's really liberating when you think like that, when you really start thinking like that. A lot of times people, when they convert any setting from a different system to another system, they want to translate the mechanics. And it's like, no, what you're doing at that point is, using D&D as the example, you're trying to play D&D through Savage Worlds, and that's not the case. You're playing Eberron using Savage Worlds, and that's a very different way to look at it. So over time, a lot of the stuff that I borrowed and whatever, I just ended up really rewriting it over and over and over again. There are a lot of things that really Savage Worlds just did out of the box, which was really brilliant. For example, Artificers, I didn't have to do anything with that. Savage Worlds has they have these different arcane backgrounds. You have magic, you have miracles, that's arcane and divine. You have psionics baked in, great. But they also have arcane background weird science. And what that is, it's effectively the weird scientist in pulp stories, right?
Right.
They usually have some sort of special substance that you have to use. In Deadlands, it was ghost rock. And in Eberron, we have dragon shards, right? And so they can create these magic items that are powered by these dragon shards, right? And using the arcane background weird science. The other cool thing about that is that those items they don't necessarily require an arcane skill to use. If you make a gun or a wand or something that blasts magical energy, that's a shooting roll. So anybody can use that.
Okay.
If it's something that's, that is more arcane, like, a wand of healing or something like that, then yeah, it's probably going to be an arcane skill roll or something. So that's magic item creation. Great. We got that solved. What about infusions? Well, Savage Worlds has an edge called Gadgeteer. And what the Gadgeteer edge allows you to do is to sort of improvisationally make a new gadget, right? I think the core rules say it takes 20 minutes, like 1d20 minutes or something like that. I can't remember exactly. I modified it for Savage Eberron to be like, you have to do it for a full round and take no other actions, right? Well, that's your infusion. I can take any power that is known to artificers and basically spontaneously imbue it on an object, and voila, I have a new quick and dirty magic item that lasts for, I think it's like 10 power points it has, and you can only do that once per session, which is fine with me. How often am I going to really need to do that, right?
Right.
So right out of the gate, right out of the box, you have your artificers. And that was just like, that's brilliant. You have a setting here that took the weird scientist concept, plopped it into a fantasy setting. You have a system over here that's taken that same concept and mechanically expresses it. I can marry these two and it just works, and it's fantastic. So yeah, it took me a long time really to learn a lot of these things and use what was there, and to really expand on, creating more things over time. And then of course, as Savage Worlds, the catalog of products expanded, I was able to borrow more material from those other products and say, oh, this is how we can do more powerful arcane casting. I can use the rituals from the Horror Companion, just get rid of the, atrocious, repercussions from failure, and, just get rid of that. And now I have a way to cast these more powerful versions of these powers, a greater range for teleportation, for example, a more powerful blast power, those kinds of things. 24-hour effects on powers, even if I wanted to.
Savage World seems to me like how D20 was in the 2000s, where is like the open source, everyone was making D20 stuff. Now it seems, especially when I'm on, say, like Kickstarter, there's always like, at whatever game is being made or pitched or whatever, there's always a Savage Worlds PDF, or you can pick out like, well, do you want something that's based on 5th edition, or do you want something that's based on Savage Worlds? And it seems like Savage Worlds is that setting, or that the mechanical system that just lends itself to pretty much anything. Because my friend, when he's running Deadlands with Savage Worlds, they were doing a spirit of I think it's like Spirit of 1866 or something along those lines.
Oh, neat.
Where it was like a 1920s type feel, or you have like the horror settings or fantasy settings, and it's just all over the place. Like it almost is like you can do anything with the setting or with the system, as long as you can come up with the setting or find somebody that's done the setting already.
Right. Yeah, and that's not to say that Savage Worlds can do everything really well, and there's some things it's just not going to do as well. Like Gumshoe is really good at that sort of investigative, style of role play. Use that, right? Don't, you could do it with Savage Worlds, but it's not going to do it as well. But it is versatile, and I sort of look at it as, it's the it's the good enough system where I don't have to learn a whole new rule system. I can just use what I know and adapt it using setting rules. That's another thing Savage Worlds has. It makes use of setting rules to modify the core rules to suit the setting or genre, which gives it the flexibility. But it's not perfect, I'll admit that.
No system is perfect, as evidenced by like the mounds of errata that comes out usually after the publishing of the main book.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I remember when 4th edition D&D came out, I know that we were blessed with the character creator, the creator for the role, like the actual characters, because there's so much stuff that had changed from the initial publishing of the book that you needed that program to actually know what you were doing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in 3rd edition, I was using e-tools like crazy, and it was just like, it just felt so complex, and there were so many options that it was like, if I really wanted to make a character well enough, if you're depending on a tool to build your characters, but if I need a tool to build a character, then there's something not quite right about the system. Like, it feels a little bit too complex to me.
I know.
Maybe that's me wearing my UX hat. Well,
I know that when we were doing 3 and 3.5, it was always, if you have the book and can bring it to the table, then you can pull like feats or classes or whatever that you want to pull from it. But if you don't have the book, then you're out of luck.
Right.
But then like 4th edition came along, and you got the character creator, and you can spend like 2, 3, 4, 5 hours clicking on every single feat and magic item. And I mean, the slog of it all, it just took forever. And then you go to the game, it's like everyone's on a computer or a tablet or whatever. And I know, like, for a long time, I was one of those people where it's like, can you guys just put your iPads down and like we can just play?
Right.
But
and it felt like a lot of those feats at the time were about, like, here you have this set of rules, right? That, that's in the core rules. And then these feats were about, okay, this lets you break that rule.
Right.
As opposed to doing something really cool.
Give me fun stuff that enhances the game, not like that just breaks the game.
Right, exactly.
Now, I found you because I don't even know how I came across the podcast, and I don't know if it was promoted on Facebook somewhere or if I had stumbled across a posting on it, like just somewhere in the internet ether was this announcement that Keith Baker, who is the creator of Eberron, was starting a podcast all about Eberron, and you are one of the hosts of it.
Yeah. So the way that started off was, so first of all, like sometime last, I don't know, November or so, Scott, who's one of the co-hosts on the show, he and I, he's a Savage Worlds fan just like me, and we would kind of joke about, being frustrated with people who just don't get Eberron. We're like, man, we should do a podcast, like, tell people how to play Eberron the right way, joking around. And, people who like oversimplify, like, oh, it's steampunk. It's like, no, it's not steampunk, or, Warforged are just robots. No, they're not,
Right.
And then coincidentally, Wayne Chang of Advantage to Insight had me on the show to talk about Eberron. And I think after we finished his Sharn series, we were like, he's like, man, we should do a podcast. And I was like, that's really funny that you say that. Because then I was also having a third conversation with Sean Kelly of Gaming and BS about doing an Eberron podcast. And so I was having these 3 different conversations at the same time with people about doing an Eberron podcast. And I'm like, all right, this is crazy. So I pulled everybody together like in an email conversation or on an IM, I can't remember which. And I was like, hey, what do you guys think about doing a group, Eberron podcast? And we're like, oh yeah. And so, I had actually even gone out and reached out to Wizards of the Coast, like, hey, we want to do a podcast about Eberron, and, we want to use the artwork, and we want to call it this, and we want to use the music from the soundtrack. And they were like, no. so I was like, all right, I don't want to call it, because originally I was going to call it like a cross Eberron or something like that.
Right.
So I was at the same time I was like kind of building up a site. So I took out all the artwork from the site. I was using like the background from the pages and stuff. Took that out. I kept the typography. I made my own sort of like quasi Eberron-ish looking logo, and we decided to go with the title Manifest Zone, because that was ambiguous. You could use that for anything, right? I mean, it's specific to Eberron, but it doesn't say Eberron per se. And that was just so that, we just want to make sure that we don't mess with WotC. Like we don't want them messing with us.
Yeah.
Sean had to bow out because we couldn't quite schedule it in a way that he could participate, but he's actually looking to do his own podcast. So keep an ear. If you look at Eberron Podcast on Twitter, on Google Plus, I think on Facebook, and just EberronPodcast.com, he's got the site up, but there's not a lot there yet.
Okay.
So he's working on that. And his approach is going to be a little bit different. I don't want to spoil it, so I won't say anything. But because Sean dropped out, I was like, you know what? I'm just curious if Keith is interested. I mean, I doubt it. I'm just going to reach out to him because I've emailed him a couple times, like in the past, I don't know how many years. And so I had his email. So I sent him an email. And he's like, yeah, I think that'd be great. I can't do it weekly. I could maybe only do it monthly. I'm like, that's great, because I can only do it monthly too. And he was totally into it. And so when we recorded that first episode, I was like shocked that I'm recording a podcast with the creator of the setting that I love, about the setting that I love. And he has been fantastic. He's great to just, he's really approachable. Gotta love the fact that he's on it. And yeah, it's just really nice. It's just really nice being able to just chat with him. And he's really cool about it. He's, very into exchanging ideas and clarifying things. And he does contribute a lot to the show, obviously, being the setting creator. So
right. Yeah.
So that's the story of it. That's how Manifest Zone manifested, so to speak. And we got a really good positive reaction from it. We're really excited. I wish we could do it more frequently. There's a lot of content to cover, but scheduling is just hard for everybody, especially for Keith and for us.
I reach out to like a set group or a set number of people every like 2 or 3 months for this podcast. And I'm lucky if maybe I get a third of them to respond back and get to the point of actually having like a recording. And I had sent Keith a message probably back July or August. And because it's on Facebook, and if you're not friends with that person, it goes into that message request folder. So you don't actually see it unless you are looking for it.
Right.
So I've been messaging back and forth with him about trying to have him come onto this podcast. And then Manifest Zone started. I was like, okay, well, between Manifest Zone and all his other projects, I don't think I'll hear from him at any point unless like something else like comes up in his schedule. Yeah. But at the same time, like I was able to talk with Matt Forbeck, who was one of the authors of like a trilogy of Eberron books. And so like getting to hear, and getting to hear his like perspective on working on those books as Eberron is rolling out, back in like, I think those books came out in 2005, give or take. Right. And it's just amazing to hear like how he's writing the books as Eberron's being developed as a system, and having like what he had to do or not do as far as like characters or what he got to play with. And I mean, Eberron is just such an amazing system. And when I found Manifest Zone, I was like, oh, it's what I have wanted, because I love listening to.
That was the other thing. I made it because I'm like, this is the podcast I've always wanted for Eberron. So if nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. Yeah.
Right. And, I searched for like Eberron podcasts, and besides like Maze Arcana, which popped up, there's one other Eberron, I think, actual play that's currently going on.
Yeah, Eberron Renewed is the title. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I haven't listened to it yet because I've just got so much other material I'm trying to get through. But like when Manifest Zone comes out, it's almost like an insta listen, where if it pops up I'm listening to it on the commute, or I'm listening to it at the house. Even when the Standing Stones or the Sending Stone episodes come out, which are only like a few minutes long, it's always that extra bit of material that I just want to hear what someone else thinks besides what I think.
Yeah, I'm really surprised at how well the Speaking Stone segments were received. That came about because we knew that we had a lot to cover content wise, and each episode was an hour long. Actually, the episode 2 was an hour and a half, close to it, just because there's so much content. But we didn't want to spend time on the show, doing the Q&A type stuff that a lot of podcasts do.
Mm-hmm.
And but we didn't want to ignore those things either. And we also knew that people are going to be really hungry for content between each monthly episode. So, the idea that I came up with was, well, what if we did this thing called Speaking Stone, or, we can call it Speaking Stone, and it'll just be sort of like, one or a few of us responding to a question that we get. Now, one of the criteria, a lot of people don't realize this, we get all sorts of questions, but one of the main criteria for a question that we'll take is it has to pertain to a topic we've covered. We've gotten all sorts of weird questions, like about anything and everything that we're like, that's really oddly specific. Or, we haven't covered that yet, but when we do, we'll be sure to keep this in the queue. So apologies to anybody who submitted a question that hasn't gotten answered.
Like me, because I know I submitted a question about probably the Talenta Plains at one point just to get more information on it.
Oh, right. Yeah. We've had a few. We've had some that were just mechanical things, where we're like, that's not really, what we're looking at. So to kind of clarify for anybody who hasn't listened to the show, what we're doing with Manifest Zone is we're not even really doing like an introduction to the setting or introduction to the elements. Although the first episode arguably could be that. What we're really looking at is we take an element of the setting, we assume people have a cursory knowledge of it, and we talk about how you can use it as a GM or as a player. How do you bring that aspect as a player to the table with your character? It's your background. How do you respond to things that pertain to it? How do you think about it? And for GMs, how can you leverage it in your stories and your campaigns and your adventures? And how do you portray it to your players, kind of a thing. So that's really where Manifest Zone's focal point is. And so it's our intent is not to replace the need for the books. Mm-hmm. Or to solve the mysterious answers of, what happened on the day of mourning or anything like that. It's really just about, again, how do you play and run an Eberron campaign? How do you use the Last War? How do you use the Dragon Marks and Dragon Mark houses? How do you think about them? That kind of thing.
Yeah, and one of the topics is about the day of mourning and how you incorporate that into like the player characters and even like the NPCs, like because it's set 2 years after the mourning, the war is over-ish, maybe, you never know, because it could just, sure, there's a treaty, but whatever.
Or 4 years after the day of mourning, 2 years after the Treaty of Thronehold.
Yes.
Right.
And just incorporating that into your characters as far as what people have had to go through. And I know with our group, we had 2 people who were playing Syrian refugees, and so they had incorporated, like, they had lost everything. They had gone through so much. They had been in like a secret prison, and it was just like all like layers upon layers upon layers of like for their character, and just getting to hear when you guys are talking about that and just how people are trying to incorporate that into their character, because it's not as if like this war ended years ago. Like for me as an almost 40-year-old, like the only war that I can really remember initially was like the Gulf War.
Right.
And again, that's not really affecting me so much. I mean, the later like stuff in Iraq and Afghanistan, I've had friends that have gone over there, but at the same time, it's not like how it is in Eberron, where almost everyone's affected at some level somehow, and you're actually still living with it and going through that. And that's like that episode just, I don't know, like it made something even click even greater than it had before, just listening to everyone talk about it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because I think especially in the United States, it's really hard for us to relate sometimes to that type of situation, because we've never had, I think the closest we've ever had a war brought to us, two situations, one Pearl Harbor, the second being 9/11, but it was never like a war where we had battlefields on, I mean, other than the Civil War, right?
Right.
The Civil War is probably the closest thing, but that, I think for our generation, obviously we're so removed from it because it's been so long, that we don't really get the full impact of it, really. We see remnants of it, but it's more from a historical perspective rather than a, that's the battlefield that my son died on, right?
Right.
It's a very different thing. It is pretty jarring when you really dive into it. And I think, Keith even made the point in that episode about like, you don't have to go that deep into it because, for some people it might actually be hard to do that on an emotional level, but you can at least just say, use the I've seen things kid, type of character.
Exactly.
Trope, Yeah, it's the Lost War. I mean, I think it's 4th edition did a really good job of playing it up more, I think, in the 4E campaign guide than 3.5 did, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just whenever the 4th edition stuff came out, I was like, I need more. Where's the rest of it?
Right, and they're like, oh, it's in the 3.5 books that you have.
You have to go back.
No.
Yeah.
But they're out of print. I can't get them for an affordable price. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was really frustrating. Yeah.
Do you think Wizards is going to do something 5th edition with Eberron, or do you think they're just going to let it sit?
No, I think they will. I mean, they did the early Eberron. The first Unearthed Arcana was Eberron. They just recently did the Mystic and Artificer. I think it's coming. I don't know if it's going to happen soon. I do think there's a bit of a fervor for it. Like people, Maze Arcana's, they're working with Wizards of the Coast to produce content. So I think there might be something going on there. But I don't know, man. I don't know what Wizards' plan is. I suspect when they do come out with something, it'll be a campaign book like, Curse of Strahd.
Okay.
That's my guess. I don't think they're going to do like, here's the campaign book, like a course setting book. You know what I mean?
Right.
It'll be like, here's an adventure campaign type thing. And then it'll be, you can just create your own adventures from there. And then DM's Guild is really where it's going to be at. That's going to be the space for Keith to be able to write all of, Plains of Eberron and the other nations of Corvair. And, I could even, I joked one time on Facebook about like, Keith being able to publish, quote as a title, Keith Baker's Eberron, where he can clean up the things that he disagreed with and, rewrite like a new Forge of War type book.
Right.
Those kinds of things. Fix the things that always irked him, but also it's going to be a space for anybody to be able to create adventures, and grow and expand from there. I think we're really going to see a massive influx of Eberron content once it's unlocked on DM's Guild.
And that will be a great time for everyone that loves Eberron.
Yeah.
Someone write something about the Talenta Plains, please.
Please,
I need more information.
Keith. I mean, poor Keith. I don't know. He's going to have so much stuff to write. But, I empathize with Keith because I can only imagine how frustrating it might be for him. He's frustrated by the fact that he doesn't own Eberron, and that he can't write whatever he wants. He's okay with the decision that he made of, handing it over to Wizards and so on. He's said that on other shows and stuff, but it is frustrating for him to not be able to just be able to publish whatever he wants. He has to be very careful about, even on his blog, he has to be very careful about how he writes things.
Right, like
there.
he's clarifying stuff that's already published, not producing new content,
or he'll say in my Eberron, but in your Eberron, so he can't just outright publish a new race or class or anything like that.
Exactly.
No, he did joke. I think I forgot where I was listening to him. He joked about doing something like a this is a spell forged, on a DM's Guild, nothing about Eberron at all. And it just happens to be a sentient, self-aware living golem, but that's not, that's not what he really wants to do. And I think he in particular would be looked at with more scrutiny by Wizards than anybody else. So
Right.
But who knows? Hopefully it will have it unlocked in the near future.
Well, Kristian, where can people find Manifest Zone if they are looking to listen or read or submit questions? What's the best avenues for them?
The best avenue is manifest.zone. That's the actual URL. I'm a little proud of that domain. So manifest.zone is our website, and we have links to all of our social stuff, Google+, Twitter, Facebook. So you can find all that there. And of course, the subscription links to the show itself. We have a form page on that site where you can submit questions for Speaking Stone. Again, we ask that the questions are related to topics we've covered, or if we've announced what our next topic is, you can ask a question about it, and we'll either try to see if it fits into the outline, or we'll address it as a Speaking Stone segment after the fact. Yeah, and that's pretty much it. Manifest.zone. That'll get you to it.
And you can find the podcast on pretty much anything at this point, I imagine, because I know I found it on like iTunes, and then on the different podcast apps that I have, it's readily available.
Yes. Yeah, we have it registered on iTunes, Stitcher, and of course any Android podcast app or any, usual podcast app can subscribe to it easily. So yeah, shouldn't be, if you do run into problems subscribing to it, let me know and we'll try to fix that. So
awesome. Well, Kristian, thank you so much for taking the time out. I know you're busy with work and then everything else that goes along with it, and role playing and podcasts and everything else. So thank you so much for the time that you've given me today. And it has been, it's nice when I get to listen to podcasts and talk to the podcast host, but it's almost like just special to talk to someone who like lives and breathes Eberron as much as I love it and devour like the books and everything about it.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, this has been fun. If anything, I wish we could have more time because I really enjoyed this. So thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fandom. Subscribe to us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. Follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Tales from the Fandom to see photos, links, leave feedback, and check out upcoming guests. If you'd like to be a guest, email David at talesfromthefandom@gmail.com.